So, y'all may or may not have noticed that this review should have been up last week, but I have been far more pressed for time over about the last week and a half than I ever expected I would be. And frankly, the best, most efficient option to free up time was just to move last week's Gravity Falls review to this week. I apologize for that. It probably won't happen again, at least not in the foreseeable future, but there it is. That said, let's talk about Irrational Treasure. Speaking of irrationality, I have an irrational love of the National Treasure movies. I admit, they're not the greatest movies of all time. I admit, they're incredibly derivative, but I have a fondness for them that goes beyond the level of fondness that any rational human being has any business having for these movies. So seeing what is rapidly becoming one of my favorite shows tackling something like National Treasure, parodying it, spoofing it, made me so excited. And while this episode didn't really blow me away at all, it did satisfy that part of me that likes the National Treasure movies. It scratched that itch, so to speak. This episode was, at its core, about Mabel, of all things. The plastic is back and has caused her to start to feel bad about being so goofy, and while she's got it in the back of her mind that maybe she shouldn't be so goofy, she and Dipper go on this, not really a treasure hunt per se, but a hunt for the truth, National Treasure style, trying to uncover who was the actual founder of the town, because they found out that the plastic's ancestor wasn't the actual founder of the town. And all throughout this hunt, it's Dipper's reason that fails and Mabel's silliness that actually advances them along on their adventure. Until finally they discover the actual founder of the town, a disgraced ex-president, who is just as goofy as Mabel, and that's all I'm going to say about him, because on the off chance you haven't seen this episode, it's a major spoiler talking about what happened with him. And I don't actually have to talk about what happened with him to talk about the rest of this episode, to talk about the rest of the stuff I want to talk about in this episode. If the stuff with him comes into play in a later episode, of course, I'll talk about it then. But as of right now, I want to talk about how, first of all, this episode validated Mabel's silliness. It didn't have some compromising message saying that she needs to grow up eventually, but it's okay to still be a little bit silly as she's doing that. No, it said that she is an entirely valid person exactly the way she is, and I love that. That was so cool, because Mabel is perfect, and I will fight you if you disagree. I also got the sense that this episode was setting up a lot of stuff, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Most interestingly in this episode, though, was the cop characters, the heavyset black cop and the tall, skinny white cop. I got couples vibes from them in this episode. I don't know if they were ever intended to be a couple, if that was ever something that the writers intended, but they definitely came off that way to me in this episode. I don't know. I guess if I'm right, don't tell me, because I don't want it spoiled. Like, if we find out down the line they are a couple, I don't want that spoiled. But there were some scenes in this episode where they came off as a couple, or at least really good friends. But I really liked them in this episode. I found them kind of annoying in their previous appearances. In this one, though, I found them really interesting. They were primarily the antagonists of this episode, trying to keep Dipper and Mabel from discovering the town's embarrassing secret. But even as antagonists, they got so many great scenes and so many great lines and so many great opportunities to shine. I'm actually looking forward to seeing these characters again now, which was not true before this episode, was not true before I watched this episode. And I've also started noticing triangles all over the place. I feel like they inserted a lot of triangles into the backgrounds of scenes in this episode, and yes, I have seen the triangle with the eye that makes up the very last frame of the opening sequence. I feel like one of you guys mentioned it in the comments to me. I had just noticed it for the first time the episode before that, and then I brought it up in my live blog of this episode, and then immediately we started to see triangles all throughout the episode. It creeped me out just a little bit. I'm assuming this is going to be a character or a symbol for a character. I don't know. I have no idea. But it definitely weirded me out and felt very deliberate. I feel like we were supposed to see these triangles, or at the very least later on we're supposed to be able to come back to this episode and say, oh hey, I really should have noticed those triangles. At the end of the day, this still isn't my favorite episode of the show. The inconveniencing is still probably my favorite episode of the show so far. But the focus on Mabel was great, and the adventure was great. The mystery could have been a little bit more in-depth, but it was fine. I can't even really complain that Dipper didn't get quite as much to do in this episode as usual, because he did get a really great scene at the end where he put the plastic in her place, and it was awesome. Actually, the more I think about it, this might be my favorite episode of the show so far. I don't know, let's say it's tied with the inconveniencing for now. But as per usual, guys, if you have seen this episode of Gravity Falls, what did you think of it? Let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below. Either way, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.
Man, revenge is underrated. That felt awesome.